There is a strip of neon about 2 kilometres east of the centre of Sydney, running under what was for years the largest Coca-Cola sign in the Southern Hemisphere. It was photographed for postcards. Tourists were driven down it. From 1967 to 1971, the government ran an official program that delivered 280,000 American servicemen onto that street, by bus, on a schedule. The clubs had licenses. The brothels had addresses. And here is where the title of this film is wrong, and it is wrong twice. It was not the Mafia. The Calabrian Mafia was real in Australia, but that was Griffith, 400 kilometres inland, and this channel has already told you that story. And none of it was secret. On the 4th of July, 1975, a woman who published a local newspaper walked into a club on Roslyn Street and was never seen again. Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories. The workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. A note before we begin. This story is told on Gadigal country, in the Eora Nation, and it contains the names of people who have died. Chapter 1. The Ridge and the Flat. King's Cross is not a suburb. It never has been. It is a locality, sitting mostly inside Potts Point, about 2 kilometres east of the Sydney Central Business District. And the first thing to understand about it is not who ran it. It is the shape of the ground. The cross sits on a ridge. From the 1830s, that ridge was where the colonial elite of New South Wales built their houses. It was called Woolloomooloo Hill, then renamed Darlinghurst, and it was carved up into a small number of very large estates with harbour views. The street names in the cross today are the names of those mansions: Roslyn, Orwell, Kellett. In the 1920s and 1930s, those estates were subdivided and the ridge filled up with Art Deco apartment blocks. Small flats, single people, writers, artists, actors, people who did not want to live the way their families had lived. And directly below the ridge, on the flat, on the water, is Woolloomooloo, wharves, terraces, working people, seamen and wharfies, and later public housing. So hold the map, because the map is the argument of this whole film. Money on the ridge, labour on the flat. And running down the spine between them, a strip of neon that both of them used and neither of them would claim. That vertical arrangement is not decoration. It is the reason the district worked the way it did. The people on the ridge had money and no interest in what happened at street level. The people on the flat had no money and no power to object. And the strip between them answered to neither, because it was nobody's neighbourhood. The junction itself was named Queen's Cross in 1897 for Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. In 1905, the council renamed it King's Cross for Edward VII, mostly to stop people confusing it with Queen's Square in the city. By 1964, a television documentary about this street was describing it as the most densely populated area of its kind anywhere in the world, with something like 100,000 people inside a single square mile. Thousands of them lived in flats, stacked above a strip, a few minutes' walk from a naval base. All of it is Gadigal country, in the Eora Nation, and it was never ceded. And that density matters more than it sounds. A suburb of freestanding houses has front yards and back fences and neighbours who notice. A suburb of small flats above shops has none of that. People come and go at all hours, and nobody can say who belongs. You could not have built a district like this one anywhere else in Sydney, because nowhere else in Sydney was shaped to hide people in plain sight. And the thing that turned it into a vice district was not a criminal. It was a vote. Chapter 2. 6 o'clock. In 1916, New South Wales went to a referendum on pub closing hours. The vote was held in the shadow of a riot. Soldiers at the Liverpool training camp had rioted in February that year, and drunkenness had become a public and political problem in wartime. The state voted to close the pubs at 6 o'clock in the evening. It was made permanent in 1923. It lasted until 1955. 39 years in the largest city in the country. Now, what that law actually did. It did not stop people drinking. Men finished work at 5 and had 1 hour, so they drank as much as they could in that hour, standing up at speed. The practice got a name that is still used in this country, the 6 o'clock swill. And then, at 1 minute past 6, the law created something else. A city of several 100,000 people who wanted a drink and could not legally buy one, so somebody sold them one. Sly grog. Illegal liquor sold after hours at a substantial markup out of clubs and back rooms and private houses that operated with the full knowledge of everybody in the neighbourhood, including the police. A temperance law built an underworld. That is the founding mechanism of this suburb, and it was not imposed by gangsters. It was passed by referendum by the voters of New South Wales for reasons most of them would have called moral, and the people who got rich on it first were 2 women. Kate Lee ran Sly Grog and Cocaine and was, for a period, one of the wealthiest criminals in Sydney. Tilly Devine ran brothels, and she could do it because of a loophole in a 1908 Act, which made it an offence for a man to live off the earnings of prostitution, but did not extend the same prohibition to a woman. Their gangs fought each other from 1927 to 1931, in what the papers called the Razor Gang Wars. They were called that for a specific reason. A 1927 Firearms Act made carrying an unlicensed pistol an almost automatic prison term, so the men who worked for those 2 women stopped carrying pistols and started carrying cutthroat razors. Notice the pattern, because it does not stop. Every law in this story produced the opposite of what it intended, and it is worth saying plainly that neither of those women was a victim of circumstance. Kate Lee was convicted repeatedly across 4 decades. Tilly Devine was convicted of assault and worse. They were violent, and the men who worked for them cut people's faces open in the street. But they existed because a parliament had created a market and then declined to police it. And when the Parliament finally repealed the 6 o'clock closing in 1955, the sly grog trade that had made them both simply evaporated. And then, in 1942, the Americans arrived. Chapter 3. The Americans. From early 1942, American servicemen poured into Sydney in numbers this country had never seen. Across the war, more than 1 million Americans spent time in Australia, and the Cross was where a great many of them came, for a reason that is purely geographical. Garden Island, the Navy's base, sits at the bottom of the ridge, a few minutes' walk from Darlinghurst Road. Some of the surviving mansions on the ridge were requisitioned as officers' clubs. And the war came closer to this street than most people now remember. On the night of the 31st of May 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines entered Sydney Harbour. One of them fired a torpedo at an American cruiser, missed and struck the depot ship HMAS Kuttabul. 21 sailors were killed, 19 Australian, 2 British, in the harbour at the end of the street. The city went into a brownout after that, lights dimmed, windows covered. And the dark was extremely good for certain trades. Servicemen carrying cash were robbed so routinely that the practice had its own name in Sydney. Gingering. A man would go with a woman and his wallet would leave with somebody else. Tilly Devine's house at 191 Palmer Street became notorious for it, and the Disorderly Houses Act of 1943 was passed partly in response. And notice what the Disorderly Houses Act actually did, because it is the same pattern again. It gave the police the power to declare a premises and shut it. What it produced was a system in which the police decided which houses were declared and which were not, and that decision was worth paying for. The club that mattered most in those years was the Roosevelt at 32 Orwell Street. It opened in 1940 under a promoter named Sammy Lee, and it became the place American officers went. And then, in 1961, a short walk from all of it, the city put up a fountain. It stands in Fitzroy Gardens at the top of Roslyn Street. It was designed by an architect named Robert Woodward, and it is a sphere of fine jets that makes a ball of water like the head of a dandelion. It opened on the 18th of November 1961. It was dedicated to the men who fought at El Alamein, a war memorial put up in a suburb that the war had made rich. Hold on to that fountain. This film is going to come back to it twice, and by the end of this story, it will have been three completely different things without ever moving an inch. There is a detail about the American money that explains everything that came after it. An Australian serviceman in 1942 was paid a fraction of what an American serviceman was paid. So the strip did not simply get busier. It got a customer with more money in his pocket than anybody local, on leave, a long way from home, with no intention of complaining to anybody about anything that happened to him. That is the ideal customer for an illegal business, and King's Cross had a naval base at the bottom of the hill supplying them. And the man who bought the Roosevelt in 1947 would spend the next 50 years as the most accused person in Australia. Chapter 4. Mr. Sin. Abraham Gilbert Saffron was born in Annandale on the 6th of October 1919. He was educated at Fort Street High School, which was then, and is now, one of the most selective public schools in New South Wales. This was not a man who came out of nowhere, and it is worth saying that early, because the legend prefers a gutter. He bought the Roosevelt in 1947, and the mechanism of what he did there is beautifully simple. Under 6 o'clock closing, the trick was to take orders before 6 and serve after. The profit sat in the gap between what a club actually sold and what it declared. The evidence given to a royal commission into the liquor trade was that the Roosevelt was taking around £1,100 a week and banking between £90 and £130 of it. Say that again slowly. £1,100 in, about £100 on the books. There is a second thing about that arrangement worth naming. A club selling illegal liquor cannot call the police when it is robbed, cannot sue anybody, and cannot advertise. What it can do is pay somebody to make its problems go away. Illegality does not remove the need for protection. It just changes who provides it and what they charge. From that, he built the rest. Hotels, clubs, and above all, property, including a great deal of property on Victoria Street, which is going to matter enormously in 2 chapters' time. He owned the Carousel Club on Roslyn Street, which from 1963 housed the Les Girls Revue, the all-male cabaret whose leading performer, Carlotta, became one of the most recognisable people in Sydney. The nickname came late. A state attorney general called him Mr. Sin in 1976, and a newspaper photograph from 1951, taken through a showgirl's legs, did the rest. And now the part that is the actual point of this chapter. Across roughly 40 years, Abe Saffron was publicly accused of arson, drug dealing, blackmail, bribery, living off immoral earnings, and worse. Royal commissions examined him. Newspapers ran his photograph for decades. He was convicted of one thing: tax evasion. In 1987, he served about 17 months, not for anything that happened in a club or on a street or to a person, for what he told the Commissioner of Taxation about his income. 40 years of allegation, 1 conviction. And this film is not going to tell you that means he was innocent of everything else, because that is not what it means. It means that for most of those 40 years, the people whose job it was to prove any of it were on the other side of the arrangement. He died on the 15th of September 2006. He was 86. And there is one more thing worth understanding about the Saffron model, because it is not what people picture. He was not primarily a gangster. He was a landlord. The money went into buildings, and buildings are legal and rent is legal. And a man who owns the premises a business operates from is very difficult to convict of what happens inside it. Everything the legend attributes to violence, the record attributes to leases. And in the meantime, the Americans came back, and the cross stopped pretending altogether. Chapter 5. The Glittering Mile. In July 1967, the United States asked for Sydney to be added to the list of destinations where its servicemen could take leave from Vietnam. Australia said yes. The first men arrived in October 1967. Between then and 1971, around 280,000 American servicemen took their rest and recreation leave in Sydney. That is roughly 1 in 10 of every American who served in that war. The scheme put something in the order of $80 million into the Australian economy, and at its peak, the trade in the cross alone was reckoned at around $9 million a month. Here is how it worked, and this is the part that demolishes the second word in the title of this film. They were flown into Sydney and bused to the Chevron Hotel on Macleay Street, a 36-storey luxury hotel with a showroom called the Silver Spade that had hosted the Beach Boys and Shirley Bassey. The Bourbon and Beefsteak opened on Darlinghurst Road in October 1967, run by a Texan named Bernie Houghton, with a 24-hour licence specifically to serve them: the Texas Tavern, the Pink Pussycat, the Whiskey A Go-Go, Les Girls. In 1964, a television documentary about this street had called it the Glittering Mile, and it went to air. There were postcards of it. There were tourist brochures. There were guided tours. The federal government of Australia was running a formal program that delivered 250,000 foreign servicemen onto one strip of road, by bus with a timetable, and everybody involved was very pleased about the money. $9 million a month is the figure that should stop you. That is not a black economy. You cannot move that much money through a few hundred metres of shop fronts without banks, landlords, licensing authorities, tax officers, and police all seeing it arrive. So what exactly do you call it when everybody can see it? It is not a secret. A secret is something people do not know. This was something people knew, photographed, advertised, and profited from. And in 1964, a few hundred metres from all of it, in Hughes Street, a Methodist minister named Ted Knopfs opened the Wayside Chapel. He opened it because the strip used people up, and somebody had to be there when it did. Coffee, a bed, a phone, no questions. It is still there, and the arrival of that money did something to the cross that it never recovered from. Before 1967, the strip was mixed. Jazz clubs, coffee lounges, theatres, restaurants. The Bohemian Quarter people still write about in comment sections. The R&R trade was worth so much, so fast, that the mix stopped paying. Within about 4 years, the strip had converted almost entirely to what the servicemen wanted. And when the servicemen stopped coming in 1971, the district was left with an economy built for a customer who no longer existed. And up on Victoria Street, on the ridge, a developer had begun quietly buying terraces. Chapter 6. Victoria Street. Victoria Street runs along the top of the ridge, a row of Victorian terraces under plane trees, looking out over the city. In the early 1970s, those terraces were full of low-income tenants. Pensioners, seamen, wharfies, artists, people paying very little rent for a view that was becoming worth a great deal. The developer, Frank Thiemann, bought the street and proposed to replace it. The residents fought him, and they had an unusual weapon: the green bans. The Builders Labourers Federation, under Jack Mundy, was refusing to supply labour to demolition and construction projects that local communities opposed. It was the first time in the world a union had used industrial power for heritage and environmental ends, and it worked. It also got dangerous. In July 1973, a resident named Arthur King was taken from his home, held for a day and released. Mick Fowler became the last resident to hold out. And then there was the publisher. Juanita Nielsen was born in 1937. She was a great-granddaughter of the retailer Mark Foy, and an heiress to part of that fortune. She lived at 202 Victoria Street and published a small local paper called Now. and she used it against the redevelopment. On the morning of the 4th of July, 1975, she had an appointment at the Carousel Cabaret on Roslyn Street. That is the club owned by Abe Saffron and managed by a man named James McCartney Anderson. She was last seen there in the late morning. She has never been found. Now the legal precision, and this is not optional, because the record here is very specific, and almost every retelling gets it wrong. 3 former Carousel employees were later charged over an earlier plan to abduct her on the 30th of June, 4 days before she vanished. That plan was not carried out. Edward Trigg pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years. Shane Martin Simmons was convicted in 1981 and sentenced to 2. Lloyd Marshall was acquitted. Every one of those charges was conspiracy to abduct, 2 convictions for conspiring to abduct her, 0 for killing her. Nobody, in more than 50 years, has ever been charged with her murder. There is a reward of $1 million, raised from $50,000 in 2021, and it has never been claimed. And the names this film is not going to misuse. James Anderson was regarded by police as a suspect. He denied any involvement and was never charged, and he died in 2003. Frank Thiemann was never charged and denied wrongdoing, and he died in 1989. Abe Saffron was never charged. This film is not going to name a killer, because no court and no coroner in more than 50 years has ever been able to. There is one more fact about that morning worth stating, because it tells you what kind of person she was. Juanita Nielsen did not have to be there. She had inherited money. She could have sold the terrace, taken the developer's offer, and lived comfortably anywhere in Sydney. Almost everybody else on that street eventually did. She was a wealthy woman who chose to spend her time producing a small local newspaper about a planning dispute, and it is the reason there is a plaque in the footpath outside her house. And when the inquest finally sat, 8 years later, the jury said something about the police. Chapter 7. An Atmosphere of Corruption. The coronial inquest into the disappearance of Juanita Nielsen opened at Glebe on the 15th of August, 1983. It ran for about 13 weeks and heard 69 witnesses. The jury found that Juanita Nielsen had died on or shortly after the 4th of July, 1975, and it found that there was not enough evidence to establish how she died, or where, or by whom. An open finding. 8 years, 13 weeks, 69 witnesses, and no answer to any of the 3 questions that mattered. And an open finding is not a technicality for a family. It means there is no death certificate that says what happened, no person to hold responsible, and no end to it. And then the jury added something that was not required of it, and it is the sentence this entire film turns on. There was evidence, they said, to show that the police inquiries were inhibited by an atmosphere of corruption, real or imagined, that existed at the time. Understand what that is. A coroner's jury, in an open court in 1983, effectively said that the reason nobody could find out what had happened to this woman was the police force of New South Wales. Now the comparison this channel has earned, because we have been here before. 2 years and 12 days after Juanita Nielsen walked into that club, on the 15th of July 1977, a furniture retailer named Donald Mackay walked out of a hotel car park in Griffith and was never seen again. 2 publishers, 2 people who said out loud what everybody in their district already knew, 2 bodies that have never been found. And here is the difference between them, and it is the title of this film. Griffith was the Ndrangheta, a genuine Calabrian criminal society, named as such by a royal commission, operating in a New South Wales farming town, with a hitman eventually convicted in Melbourne. That was the Mafia, and it was 400 kilometres inland. King's Cross was not. There was no imported society in the Cross. No oath, no initiation, no boss of bosses, no Sicilian anything. What ran King's Cross was a set of Australians making money from Australian vice, with Australian police taking a percentage. It was something this country built for itself, out of a temperance law, a naval base, and a police force that had worked out what the traffic would bear. So, again, what is the word for it when everybody can see it? And notice how long nothing happened. The inquest reported in 1983. The finding about the police was public, printed in newspapers, available to any minister or commissioner who wanted to read it. And for the next 11 years, the arrangement in King's Cross carried on exactly as it had, which is the strongest evidence in this entire film for the thesis that knowing was never the problem. It took another 11 years and one detective who agreed to wear a camera. Chapter 8. The Laugh. In May 1994, an independent member of the New South Wales Parliament named John Hatton stood up and forced a royal commission into the state's police service. He did it against both major parties. The motion passed on the 11th of May. Justice James Wood presided. And the thing that made this commission different from the ones before it was that it did not begin by asking people to give evidence. It began by gathering it first, in secret, and then confronting the witnesses with what it already had. And the instrument that broke it open was a King's Cross detective. In September 1994, Trevor Harkin rolled over. Investigators fitted his car with a concealed camera and microphone and sent him back to work. In June 1995, that camera recorded Graham Fowler, known to everybody as Chook, the chief of detectives at King's Cross, taking $1,000 in cash in the front seat of the car. Fowler had been attempting to retire on a disability pension, on the basis of a back injury he said he sustained slipping on a milkshake. He had denied under oath that he had ever taken a bribe. Then they played the tape. He was convicted of receiving a bribe and of giving false evidence, and sentenced in 2000. He died in 2013. And the $1,000 was not the point. The point was that it was routine enough to be filmed on an ordinary working day. Now the system, and it had a name. The detectives called it the Laugh. Weekly payments, collected from vice operators and drug dealers along the strip, and split among the detective sergeants and the chief detective. Not the occasional bribe, a rent roll collected on a schedule, the way a landlord collects. And it went further than money. There was an arrangement the Commission called the Green Light. Selected criminals were permitted to operate, while their competitors were arrested and their operations shut down, which means the police in this district were not merely tolerating the trade, they were allocating it. Justice Wood delivered his final report on the 15th of May 1997, and the sentence that matters is his own. The state of corruption found, he wrote, could only be regarded as systemic and entrenched. And the man who had said otherwise was the Commissioner of Police. Tony Lauer had publicly maintained that corruption in the force was not systemic and that the King's Cross Patrol was clean. The Commission found it was among the most corrupt in the state. He resigned in February 1996. By March 1998, the reported tally was 19 officers dismissed under one provision of the Act, 3 under another, 14 resigned, and 4 medically discharged. Across the whole process, hundreds left the force. And it is worth being fair about the scale of what Wood actually did, because royal commissions in this country have a reputation for producing paper and nothing else. This one produced convictions, resignations, a new oversight body, and a set of recommendations that included the injecting centre this film is going to finish on. It did not fix policing in New South Wales. It did end the King's Cross arrangement, which had survived every previous attempt, and none of it had anything to do with what finally closed the cross. Chapter 9. Two Punches. On the 7th of July 2012, an 18-year-old named Thomas Kelly was walking on Victoria Street with his girlfriend. The same street. A stranger walked up and punched him once in the head. He fell and he died 2 days later. On New Year's Eve 2013, metres from the same spot, an 18-year-old named Daniel Christie was punched once in the head. He died in January. 2 boys, 18 months apart, on the same footpath, each killed by a single punch from somebody they did not know. Neither of them had done anything at all. On the 24th of February 2014, the New South Wales government brought in what everybody calls the lockout laws across the King's Cross and Central Business District precincts. A 1:30 in the morning lockout, meaning no new patrons after that time. 3 o'clock last drinks. Bottle shops closed at 10. And new offences for fatal one-punch assaults carrying up to 25 years. Now what they achieved, because it is properly measured, and it deserves to be stated plainly. The New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics found that non-domestic assaults in the King's Cross precinct fell by 53% over the following 5 years. St Vincent's Hospital, which received the casualties, reported around a quarter fewer seriously injured patients in the high alcohol hours. And now what they cost, and these are industry and consultancy figures, so they are attributed rather than asserted. Across the affected precincts, 418 licensed premises closed against 242 new licences, a net loss of 176 venues. A Deloitte report, adopted by a New South Wales Parliamentary Committee, put the foregone nighttime economy at around $16 billion. And assaults in Newtown, Double Bay, Bondi and Coogee rose by about 30%, which tells you that a meaningful share of the trade moved rather than stopped. Both of those things are true at once. 2 families lost their sons. A district lost its economy. Nobody in this argument gets to pretend that is a simple trade, and the argument is still running in the comments under every video anybody makes about this street. There is a version of this argument that says the lockouts were an excuse, and that the district was going to be gentrified anyway by property prices. There is something in that, but the sequence is not in doubt. 2 young men were killed on the same footpath, and a government acted, and a district that had survived everything else did not survive the response. The lockouts were lifted in the city in January 2020, in King's Cross on the 8th of March 2021, and the last restrictions were abolished in January 2026. By then, there was very little left to reopen, and there is a bleak irony in the timing that nobody planned. The laws that finally emptied King's Cross were passed to stop young men dying on its footpaths, 17 years after a royal commission had emptied it of the corruption that made it dangerous in the first place. The Cross survived the razor gangs, the Americans, the heroin trade and the police. It did not survive being made safe. Chapter 10. The Fountain. Walk Darlinghurst Road now. The Bourbon and beefsteak is gone. Sold in 2019, the site redeveloped. The Carousel building is a hotel. The Chevron is gone. Les Girls is gone. Porky's, the Love Machine, the Texas Tavern, Surf City, the Rex, all gone. And the comment sections underneath every walking tour anybody posts of this street say the same thing, in almost the same words, over and over. It's dead. It's a ghost town. It's a museum of what used to be. They are not wrong about the street. Whatever this place was, it was not this. But 400 metres from where Juanita Nielsen was last seen, there is a door with a buzzer. It opened in May 2001 on a recommendation that came out of the Wood Royal Commission. It is the medically supervised injecting centre, and it was the first facility of its kind in the Southern Hemisphere. It was bitterly opposed when it was proposed, and it has now operated for a quarter of a century. The founding director has said that before it opened, this suburb was losing 2 people a week to fatal overdoses. Since it opened, it has supervised more than 1 million injections. It has managed more than 11,000 overdoses. Nobody has ever died in it. So hold the 2 numbers together, because they are the same number. In more than 50 years, the number of people charged with killing Juanita Nielsen is 0. In 25 years, the number of people who have died in that room is 0. The same figure. It means the exact opposite thing, and both of them are what this suburb is. One is the cost of an arrangement nobody would break. The other is what happened when somebody finally did. What else stands? Number 202 Victoria Street, Nielsen's own terrace, went onto the New South Wales State Heritage Register on the 27th of June, 2014, and there is a plaque set into the footpath outside it. The terraces were saved. Not all of them, and not in the way the residents wanted, and not before a man was kidnapped and a woman disappeared. But they are still standing, which is more than can be said for most of what has been fought over in this city. And down on the flat, in Woolloomooloo, there is a community centre named after her. And at the top of the street, in Fitzroy Gardens, the Alamein Fountain is still running. Think about what that object has been. It was built in 1961 to commemorate a battle in a war that had already remade this suburb and filled it with money. Then, for something like 30 years, it was the best-known place in Australia to meet a drug dealer. People said, "Meet me at the fountain," and everybody knew exactly what that meant. And it stands a short walk from the King's Cross police station in full view the entire time. And today it is cleaned and restored and photographed by people who know neither of those things. 3 completely different objects. It has never moved an inch. So, one last time, what do you call it when everybody can see it? It is not a conspiracy. A conspiracy requires concealment, and there was none here. It is an arrangement. And an arrangement only ever needs one thing to keep working, which is for the people who can see it to decide that it is not theirs to do anything about. The strip was licensed. The clubs had addresses. The government ran the buses. A coroner's jury said in 1983 that the police were the problem, and it took another 14 years for anybody with power to act on it. And the woman who said it out loud in her own newspaper is still missing. The fountain is still running.